Thank you for all who have come to my talk. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to present my research on the local self-governance reform in the Russian Empire. So my project is pretty much motivated by the global process of subnational democratization, of the proliferation of local self-governance, that you can see plotted on this figure. So on the vertical axis, you can see the percentage of countries which have elected government in a given year. And you can see we all know about the post-World War II wave of subnational and national democratizations, which is reflected on this figure. Much less is known about the growing adoption of representative elected self-governance, both at the local and regional level, over the 19th century, especially rapid in its second part. And these dashed figures show the adoption of the initiation of local and regional self-governance reform in the Russian Empire, which was the part of this process. So the Russian Empire, in particular in 1870, it started its large-scale municipal reform that granted self-governance to most of its 7 million urban population. And this reform is the subject of my study. This map, which plots the dynamics, the reform dynamics, can give you the idea of how the reform was developing across time. So first, within the Russian Empire, it covered the central Russian Eastern Ukraine, then central Ukraine and Belarus, then Baltic provinces. And the Polish part actually never received self-governance until 1917. So the most important related question, one of the most important related questions here is what was the impact of all this growth of self-governance? And here I focus on the case of the Russian Empire. So the main research questions that I want to ask is what was the impact of local democratization in terms of governance efficiency, which is measured by fiscal revenues and expenditures and provision of public services. And the second question is what were the factors moderating the impact of democratization on these indicators? So here is a brief overview of my presentation. I will proceed with the theoretical part where I formulate my predictions regarding the impact of democratization on revenues and expenditures. Then I proceed with sort of like historical review, which will provide you the necessary context of the reform, its prerequisites and its contents. Then I go on with the empirical part. I will talk about the data set that I collected, about my empirical design, and about my statistical results showing the impact of democratization. So now let's say a few words about the existing literature. What does literature studying both like national and subnational level democratization tells us about its impact? So there are plenty of country-level studies of democratization which show mostly positive or at least null effect of democratization on various economic outcomes and redistribution. But the studies, they face a lot of problems in terms of identification, like reverse causality, immediate variable bias. And in order to solve these problems and to expand the number of cases that can be examined, the researchers, they increasingly turn to subnational studies. And in this sense, various like political and fiscal decentralization reforms, which often involve the creation of some kind of elected government, they enable us to study the democratization at the local level. But here there are also certain problems. For instance, there is a number of historical studies of subnational democratization, like granting autonomy to cities, but they often lack measurable outcomes or temporal variation. And in this way, my work, although it is like also historical, is closer to a number of different studies which cover some municipal reforms of 19th and 20th century. So this is just a recent stream of work. But overall, still the number of cases that we can study in this fashion is limited. And the case of the Russian Empire, which is the case of a really large-scale reform, which covers a huge, diverse territory and introduces everywhere uniform institutions, is very, very important and useful in this sense. So regarding Furthermore, what are the predictions in the literature regarding the role of democratization? So first of all, there is a very rich literature which says about the positive impact of decentralization of public goods and quality of governance. Like plethora of various mechanisms like informational advantage, greater accountability, transparency, accounting for cross locality heterogeneity and interjurisdictional competition and so on. But regarding empirics, there is sort of ambiguity. For instance, if we take like historical studies on granting autonomies to cities in medieval times, which helped to protect property rights and commercial interests of merchant elites. Initially, it helped to promote growth, but then it was reversed due to the oligarchic capture. And also, there are some interesting studies of franchise expansion in English cities, and but they show that the effect depends on the distributional preferences of different strata. For instance, like poorer classes, as some research shows, they would prefer redistribution in the form of welfare benefits rather than more public goods. So some studies of like more recent reforms like in China, Russia, Indonesia, and sometimes they show like positive effects, sometimes very limited positive or no effect. So there is still a lot of ambiguity, and this is kind of motivates to continue studying the role of subnational democratization and introducing more cases of municipal reforms.
There's a huge, a lot of the political science literature, if you think about like Wibbles or Rada, they talk a lot about how decentralization, especially Wibbles, like leads to it's not just a negative, but it's like leads to corruption. Might want to think about the literature as well, that there's a lot, especially the political economy development literature is much more ambiguous about decentralization. I would even say negative about decentralization as leading, it decentralizes corruption. It doesn't have a lot of positive say, but doesn't have a lot of positive things to say about decentralization.
Well, thanks a lot, John. Yeah, this is really helpful. It not only like strengthen my motivation for the study. Yeah, this is super important. Yeah, I will add it. So what are my expectations on the positive effect of the reform? So maybe contrary to what John thought, so I'm also like on the positive side. So like,
I'm with you though.
By default, I expect like a positive effect of representative institutions should lead to higher fiscal revenues, spending on public goods, and what are the possible mechanisms is like. There's a greater autonomy and accountability of urban self-governance to local communes, which helps to account for the local needs and preferences, and also it's accounting for preferences heterogeneity across communes as a related mechanism, which is often mentioned in decentralization literature. There can be like a distribution in favor of poorer classes, but as we saw, it also depends on their preferences and depends on where they have real say in their affairs. And one interesting mechanism, which also stems from like historical literature, especially in the Russian Empire, is the influence of ideas. So sometimes this like local self-governance institutions, they allow the representation of like progressive-minded, like pro-development activists, which were in favor of programs of public spending. And also, I will consider moderating factors, and I will discuss it in more detail in my empirical section. So there are potential variables that would moderate the effect of the reforms, like the level of industrial development, different aspects of the social structure, and ethno-religious heterogeneity. So what is interesting about the case of the Russian Empire? What can it tell us? So first of all, it is a very case of really large and very diverse developing country, diverse in terms of geographically diverse in terms of like socioeconomic structure, like ethno-religious heterogeneity, economic structure and economic development. And it's in urban areas where live about like 7.5 million urban dwellers in more than 700 cities on the Russian Empire. So it really provides you like a scale and a variation to test like possible determinants of the efficiency of subnational democratization. And it's this reform, the reform that I studied, was really understudied like institutional shock, or sort of like national experiment, where this like a top-down imposition of uniform institutions on the overall hundreds of Russian cities, and this is also not like frequently met in the literature. This kinds of exogenous, large-scale exogenous events. Also, it can be seen as sort of hard test for democratization, because we have the setting, authoritarian setting, authoritarian at the national level, a very weak civil society, relatively weak state capacity and institutions, at least at the beginning of this reform. So it's all odds are really against the organization of efficient self-governance. And finally, despite all that, we have a very rich statistical information collected, which allows us to evaluate the efficiency of the reform and different aspects of changes in revenues, expenditures, and public goods. So why we should here is like kind of historical overview, and I would like to start with the question: why in the first place that SARS would be interested in reforming urban self-governance? And as we can see, one of the key goals was exactly which is a common goal in many contemporary decentralization reform, is to promote local development, to improve fiscal outcomes, to improve the provision of public goods. And here's the Catherine II, who instituted like the previous city charter in 1785, and she like explicitly stated her goal was to promote like good faith in trade, industry, and crafts, and help people promote the elevation of places in which they live into flourishing conditions. But so it was in the late 18th century. But whatever were the intentions, the real functioning of the self-governance, it faced a lot of problems. And it, in fact, until this reform of 1870, it remained pretty much dysfunctional because it lacked autonomy from provincial and empirical authorities who heavily stifled its activities, who could veto any kind of its spending and taxation decisions. And as a result, it faced a lack of funds to cover its costs and provide public goods, and it faced a lack of interest on the part of the public and the members of the self-governance itself. So it did not function properly, and by the second half of the 19th century, it became increasingly clear that the way it functions and the whole institutional framework of urban self-governance is heavily obsolete, and it doesn't meet the needs neither of the state nor of the public. And what triggered these reforms was the defeat in the Crimean War, which Russia waged against the Ottoman Empire, Britain, and France. And after that, the Russian elites, they realized that they fall behind Western countries in terms of development. And then the Tsar Alexander II launched a series of modernization reforms, which included the abolition of serfdom, the introduction of self-governance at the provincial and district levels, creation of independent courts. And one of these reforms was the Municipal Reform of 1870, which granted self-governance to Russian cities. And you can see that the Tsar Alexander II, so in the new legislation, they added this explicit motivation that the previous laws, they lost their relevance, so they require a radical update. So what kind of update it was? The provision of the new legislation of 1870, most importantly, they included the creation of the autonomous legislative and executive bodies, which were elected, contained of dozens of deputies at least, and they decided on budget and on local economic and social affairs. So the franchise was still pretty limited. It included mostly males, mostly like property and business owners. So in larger cities, it could be about like 5% on average, but in smaller cities, it could be even more than 10% of the population. So still limited, but still something. And important for the reform, they unified and somewhat expanded the revenue sources available to local self-governance, and also imposed more structure and some kind of very loose prescriptions on the expenditures. So here just wanted to show one of sort of results of the reform. So here is the building of this local city council, Duma, where the elected deputies convened. And so this sign, it says exactly like city council, Городская Дума in Russian. So it is located in Tula. It was a provincial capital and an important industrial center. So getting back to the reform dynamics, as I have already shown you, the reform was adopted in a gradual fashion, and different geographical regions, different geographical regions, it was launched at different periods of time. But overall, by 1884, almost all the European part of the Russian Empire, except for Poland, received new institutions. And so on this figure, we can see the dynamic of the reform by year. So the height of these bars, it shows the number of cities that adopted new institutions every year. And you can see that there is concentration in the first several years mostly. But still, if we go like throughout the next decade, there still remains a substantial number of cities that haven't yet received self-governance, and they can serve as a basis for comparison in order to establish the effect of the reform. So, in order to answer my research questions, I have collected a novel and unique data set. And one of its main components is that the novel data on the aggregate cities' revenues and expenditures. So there are like two panels. So the first is the period averaged approximately 5-year panel covering the years between 1840 and 1884, and it contains data on about 500 cities. And another is a yearly panel for a shorter period, 1870 to 1804, but it covers about 700 cities. So inconveniently, the same source that contains the data on this aggregate revenues and expenditures, it also has information on the year in which each city received new institutions, which is crucial for my research design. In addition to aggregate figures, I also collected data like for several snapshots providing detailed composition of revenues and expenditures in several years, just to show not only like aggregate figures but also different components of the budget. And also, another outcome is which is closer to the actual measure of actual provision of public goods, is the number of schools before and after the reform. And all this data collection, it took like hundreds of hours, and because it takes a lot of time to digitize these historical statistical sources, to extract and clean the data, and so partly because the whole volume of information is very large, and also sometimes like the printing quality of this sources is far from ideal. So this is an example. It's just a snapshot of book spread from of the table, statistical table, which shows aggregate revenues for this list of cities in every year between 1870 and up to 1884. So now I would like to explain my empirical design. So I use the method called staggered difference indifference design, which enables me to find the effect of the reform by comparing those cities that have already received new institutions with those that haven't yet received this. And also the validity of so the problem with this is that the reform adoption, it was not fully random. And therefore, the validity of this design may be questioned, the validity of this comparison. So therefore, I adopt different various alternative methods of estimation, which help me to alleviate this problem. And all of them, these are like more recently developed methods of difference and differences, and they all mostly confirm my baseline findings. So I can talk about them in more detail if necessary. So this is my baseline statistical model, the unit of observation of the city in a certain period or year. And the dependent variable of interest is the logarithm of revenues or expenditures per capita in a given city year. And the main independent variable of interest, my treatment variable, is equal to, takes the value of 1 once the reform starts, the city receives new institutions, and take the value of 0 before that. And so this coefficient beta is my main quantity of interest, which is the effect of the reform. And I also, in terms of specification, I have controls. Also, in my baseline specification, I have town fixed effects and province year, or province period fixed effects that help me account to some time varying and observable factors like price changes. Yes.
So, in terms of the structure of the decentralization, was it you mentioned some of the failed reforms under Catherine Gray, where there wasn't like a lot of structural reform at the provincial level as well, right? So in this reform, I'm assuming that there was more reform also at the provincial level and then the district level, so that this reform at the city level, I guess the reason I'm asking is like, what is the revenue situation at the provincial level and at the district level? Are they also decentralized? Do they also have these dumas created? Or is it something just hyper, focused on the local level? That's not like the reforms in Ukraine right now are like this. You have these armadas, but you don't have reforms at the provincial or the district level, just at the local level.
Yes, very good question. So they had a structure, actually, it was done at 4 levels. So they had provincial level земствos, but they had district level, also district level земствos as well. So they were mostly engaged in like rural issues, partly in urban, but mostly in rural. In cities, but additional level in cities, so this urban self-government, and at the lowest level were like a peasant self-governments. So they also had the local self-governance, which was separate from other social groups, social states. And we can also add like self-governance by nobility, which existed even before that. But what is important, the authorities, they wanted to avoid any like kind of political repercussions. So they tried to limit the powers, the sphere of activities of the self-governance to like economic matters, like development, like public goods, like and so on.
Because if you had decentralization at those other levels, it would affect this revenue dynamic, I think, at the local level, wouldn't it?
Yes, I agree with you. It would be interesting because in some provinces, for example, this земствos at province and district level, it was introduced in some provinces, but not in others. And potentially we can compare the functioning of urban self-governance of province with and without zemstvos. But usually, there is a lot of, usually it seems quite separated from each other. And so there are complaints that zemstvos do not help a lot with like urban affairs. And it was very interesting dynamics. I just.
Which you would argue would affect.
I have to focus on this because, we can consider it as separate. So they have like separate rights. They have sort of like taxes, separate taxes that it could collect. It was different system from.
Because variation provincial level, if there's variation in provincial level, it would affect the revenue generation at city level.
Well, statistically, I can account it using this province year fixed effects, yes, but substantively, it would be interesting. I think to examine. I guess I can't say much more about it. I think it's another understudied topic, understudied than this urban reform itself. Thanks so much. This is really a great question for further investigation. Before presenting my statistical results, I would like first to show you that even if we look at the raw data, we can already discern the impact of the reform. So in this figure, I show average expenditures for several cohorts. Cohorts, I mean these groups of cities that received new institutions at a certain period. And this vertical axis shows the minimum average logarithm of expenditures per capita. And on the horizontal axis, you see periods, different averaged periods in which we can observe these expenditures. And the main point of this figure is when a solid line crosses the dashed vertical line of the same color, which denotes the beginning of the reform in this cohort, we should observe a large trend break or a persistent increase in revenues. And we see this is what happens for this first cohort between this and this point, which is crosses this line. For the second cohort between this and this periods, and for the third cohort, we started to be treated in 1880, between 1880 and 1884. So for each cohort, we can see this effect. And this group, which remained untreated, you can see that it has pretty similar trend over all the period. And another important thing which follows from this figure, if we look at the pre-reform trends of these cohorts, they look more or less similar. There's some divergence, but they look more or less similar, which speaks in favor of the parallel trends assumption, which is necessary for the identification of them. So these are my baseline difference in different estimates for revenues and expenditures on this period averaged panel. And so this is the coefficient of interest. And you can see that whatever model we use, always see a very strong positive effect on both revenues and expenditures. And even the most demanding models, like models 4 and 8, which include both the city fixed effects and province here fixed effects and linear city trends, we see that the reform increased the level of revenues and expenditures by about 20%. And here, so here I show the static effects, and here we can allow to change the effect of the reform over time. So the so-called event study, and on the left panel we show the effect on revenues, on the right panel effect of on expenditures, and you can see these coefficients to the right of this vertical dashed line, coefficients of the treatment period, and you can see that they're all quite large and positive, and there is even increase in the effect between the first and the second periods of the reform. And the picture is very similar both for revenues and expenditures. And if you look at the previous period, it's called pre-treatment coefficients in the pre-treatment period, they are all insignificant, which means that the trends for treated and non-treated cohorts in the pre-reform period were very similar, which once again means that our identification assumptions, they make sense. It's additional evidence in favor of this parallel trends assumption. And also I wanted to show this event study, but now for yearly panel, because it shows a pretty similar picture to the period average panel. But what is interesting, it shows you how fast the effect of the reform propagated. So you can see, you can already see a significant effect already in the first year of the reform, and the dramatic increase by the second year. So the effect was not also large, but it was pretty fast, which is also sort of surprising. And also these are my baseline estimates, and also used plenty of different alternative difference and difference estimates, and they will show a similar picture, including synthetic difference and differences that allow me to construct more credible counterfactual trajectories for treated cohorts of cities, and it show even stronger effects. So we have established the effects on fiscal indicators, but what about more tangible things like provision of public goods? And here we have the data on the number of schools, and I see panel difference and difference estimates shows there was a very sizable impact on the number of primary schools. So after reform, cities started to build more schools, and here are the examples of the schools they built. Here is the primary schools in Kazan, for instance. It was a place with mixed Russian Tatar population. Here is one of the schools in some Siberian town. So they all were built before the revolution and during this periods of transformation. So next, I would like to say a few words about possible moderating factors, which would be interesting to study. First is this social composition. It would be interesting to explore the role of the merchants, because merchants before and to considerable extent after the reform, they played a central role in urban self-governance. But interestingly, we do not see a positive effect, rather sort of like a negative effect on the side of the reform effect in cities with a high share of merchants, which seems to be conformal with some historical evidence showing that in many cases, in city councils, merchants were sort of like conservative force, whereas these like progressive-minded activists were like more pro-development, pro-spending. So they led these pro-spending coalitions. We do not see any correlation with like the share of Meshchanie, which was a backbone of urban middle class, and some authors ascribe to it particularly like pro-market and pro-democratic culture. And we do not see also significant interaction with the share of nobility, which was on the most educated estate, but probably the most loyal to the monarchy on average. Also, interestingly, we do not see a positive interaction with industrialization measured by the number of workers per capita, and in conjunction with the result of merchant, it shows that unlike in some European countries, as existing literature shows, in the Russian cities, there was no like this pro-spending coalition of industrialists or like a commercial interest who wanted to spend more on so-called capital-enhancing public goods like healthcare and education, which can improve the quality of the labor force. So at least in the Russian Empire, at least like in the first years or a decade or two of this reform, such coalition was still non-existent. But what seemed to be really important was ethno-religious heterogeneity. So in places with greater religious fractionalization and with a lower share of Orthodox, which was the dominant religious group in the Russian Empire, we see a larger effect of the reform, which on the one hand, it could reflect probably the empowerment of previously discriminated groups, but on the other hand, it also speaks to the literature, which shows that in highly diverse communities, the creation of some kind of position of formal institutions could help them to solve their coordination issues and organize in order to provide more public goods. So finally, I'd like to say a few words about the composition of revenues and expenditures, which helps us to understand how did the cities raise money and to cover their expenses and what they spent on. This shows the per capita, these two bars shows the per capita revenues expressed in rubles per capita in year 1862 before the reform and in 1884, this last year in our sample. And we can see there was a large increase in the income from public property. So it was non-tax income. It was like profits from like leasing out some public land or public buildings. So you can see that reform greatly increased the efficiency of using this property. It also started to issue much more licenses for business and trade. The real estate tax really increased because before the reform, only a few cities they levied the tax on real estate, but it became common after the reform. And also some extraordinary revenues grew up, and they consisted of such things as profits from public banks, from city endowments, also sometimes from treasury subsidies. Of course, not all this difference can be ascribed to the reform itself because it is measured over quite a long period, but still it is illustrative of how the composition changed. And the next slide is about the spending. So how did these cities spend their money? So we see they can start to spend much more on administration, police and firefighters, and more on maintenance and improvement of public buildings and infrastructure, way more, if you see, on education and healthcare, which was really seemed to be one of the most important things which changed after the reform. But interestingly, I started to spend much more on the military, on the maintenance of the military, which was absolutely controlled by the state and reflected state priorities rather than local priorities. So the idea is that this increased spending, they managed to combine both priorities of local communities and the state. And also these other expenditures, they included such things, for example, as building and construction of new buildings, which was also expanded considerably. So what are the implications of my research? So say in short, I've shown that subnational democratization, it really helps mobilize revenues and promote public goods. And as I show, it can be in a really like unfavorable setting, like under autocracy, with institutional and state capacity, and across highly diverse localities, we can still observe this large and significant effect. So what are the possible next directions for study? What are the interesting questions to explore? So first of all, the reform entailed different components like democratization in terms of the introduction of elected governance, but also increased autonomy, increased ability to increased taxation ability. And so it would be interesting to further study how these different components, they contributed to the impact of the reform. Also, it will be interesting to study the role of representation and influence of various social groups in elected councils. Also, it will be interesting to see what were the long-term effects. So was these effects that I showed persistent, and what were the long-term implications for the economic and political development of the empire? And the last one is the project, it's my ongoing project on which I work. It studies the determinants of the introduction, not the consequences, but the causes of introduction, just to see why some cities received self-governance earlier, why some of them received later. Last thing, I just want to tell a few words about my broader agenda, and here I focus on its part that studies the historical political economy of the Russian Empire. I have a book project studied the political economy of conflict and development in the Russian Empire, and that explores two main themes, like the legacy of serfdom and its influence on rural conflict, and also the ambiguous impact of industrialization on peasant discontent. I also have several projects which explore the role of ethno-religious diversity on some kind of conflict and political outcomes. So study the determinants of anti-Jewish pogroms, the popularity of Russian far-right parties before the revolution, and also determinants of religious conversions. So thank you so much for your attention. So I would be happy to answer your questions and discuss my research.